In the 14th century, West Africa was home to one of the most prosperous and influential empires in the history of the continent, the Mali Empire. Spanning vast territories, it was a realm of unimaginable wealth, cultural flourishing, and political power. At its heart was the legendary city of Timbuktu, a place that would come to symbolize the height of learning, trade, and Islamic scholarship. Yet, at the time, Timbuktu was still on the cusp of its transformation from a quiet desert outpost to a global center of intellectual and economic activity. It was within this context that a man named Musa, who would become known to history as Mansa Musa, ascended to the throne of Mali in 1312. Mansa Musa's reign would come to define an era, propelling the empire into a period of remarkable wealth and prestige. His legacy, however, is not merely measured by the gold he amassed or the trade routes he controlled, but by the cultural and intellectual revolution he fostered, an enduring legacy that would leave an indelible mark on Timbuktu. Timbuktu's status as a vibrant center of commerce and learning was already beginning to take shape when Mansa Musa became emperor. Situated along the trans-Saharan trade routes, the city had long been a crossroads for merchants, scholars, and travelers. Its strategic position allowed it to serve as a critical juncture in the exchange of goods, ideas, and knowledge between the Islamic world, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Salt, gold, ivory, and slaves flowed through its bustling marketplaces, while scholars arrived from distant lands to study and teach in its vibrant schools. Yet, it was still in its early stages of becoming the intellectual beacon it would eventually become. The foundations were laid, but the grand transformation was yet to come. Mansa Musa's reign marked the beginning of this transformation, and his journey from a relatively unknown ruler to one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in history was anything but conventional. Musa was not born into power in the way many rulers are. His rise to the throne followed the death of his predecessor, and it was said that Musa, though born into the royal family, had not initially been in line for the throne. It was only when the previous king's heir died that Musa, the royal regent, was elevated to the throne. This unexpected ascent to power would prove to be a blessing. For Mansa Musa's vision for Mali would reshape not only the fate of the empire, but the very cultural fabric of West Africa. Mansa Musa was not a man who simply inherited power. He was a visionary who understood that wealth alone could not ensure lasting greatness. He recognized the importance of education, culture, and intellectual exchange in shaping the future of his empire. For him, it was not enough to be the ruler of a rich land. He sought to make Mali a beacon of learning and civilization that could rival the greatest centers of the medieval world. He would later embark on a journey that would not only increase Mali's wealth, but also elevate its cultural and intellectual standing on the world stage. One of Mansa Musa's most defining acts was his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, a journey that would change the way the world viewed Mali. When Musa set out with an entourage that included thousands of soldiers, courtiers, and slaves, it was not simply a religious journey. It was a carefully orchestrated display of Mali's wealth and power. Along the way, he distributed gold generously to those he encountered, making such an impact on the people of Egypt that the local economies were thrown into disarray. He gave so much gold to the people of Cairo that it caused the price of the precious metal to plummet, a testament to the staggering wealth of the Mali Empire under his rule. Mansa Musa's journey to Mecca served as a living testament to his wealth, but it was also a strategic move that had far-reaching consequences. Upon his return to Mali, Musa used the prestige he had garnered from his pilgrimage to attract scholars, architects, and artists to Timbuktu. He understood that the wealth he controlled was only part of the equation. To solidify his empire's legacy, he needed to foster a cultural renaissance that would ensure the enduring prominence of Mali long after his reign. Timbuktu, once a quiet desert settlement, began to undergo a radical transformation. Mansa Musa's reign was marked by the establishment of grand mosques, libraries, and centers of learning. Among the most famous institutions was the University of Sankore, a leading intellectual hub where scholars from across the Muslim world gathered to study and teach. Timbuktu became home to thousands of manuscripts, some of which remain invaluable sources of knowledge to this day. This cultural explosion would lay the groundwork for the city's reputation as one of the most important centers of Islamic scholarship in the medieval world. Mansa Musa's patronage of the arts and education was not an isolated act. It was a conscious decision to invest in his people and future generations. He recognized that intellectual capital could be just as valuable as gold in ensuring the long-term prosperity of his empire. Under his rule, Mali became not only a powerhouse of trade, but also a beacon of enlightenment. Scholars from North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond flocked to Timbuktu, contributing to the city's intellectual richness. As a result, Mali's reputation as a center of Islamic learning spread throughout the known world, drawing the attention of scholars, traders, and travelers alike. But while Mansa Musa's patronage of Timbuktu brought global attention to the city, it also spurred a sense of pride and cultural identity within Mali. Timbuktu was no longer just a city of trade, it was a city of ideas. It was a place where knowledge was valued as much as wealth, and where scholars were as highly esteemed as merchants. This shift in cultural priorities would help solidify Mali's position as one of the most powerful and influential empires in Africa during the medieval period. Timbuktu's growth under Mansa Musa also coincided with a period of relative political stability. Although the empire faced challenges from neighboring kingdoms and nomadic groups, Mansa Musa's reign brought cohesion to Mali, allowing the empire to focus on internal development. The wealth that flowed into the empire from the gold mines of the Bambuk region fueled a flourishing economy, enabling Musa to invest in infrastructure, military strength, and the arts. The rise of Timbuktu as a center of learning was not merely a result of Mansa Musa's wealth, but of his ability to maintain a stable and prosperous society that could support such an intellectual revolution. Yet, Mansa Musa's empire was not without its challenges. Though he managed to cultivate a period of peace and stability, there were always forces at play that threatened the unity of the empire. The vast expanse of Mali's territories required constant vigilance and strong leadership. Despite his achievements, the decline of Mali's power began shortly after his death. However, the legacy of Timbuktu, the golden age that Mansa Musa ushered in, would endure for centuries. In the annals of history, Mansa Musa stands as a figure whose vision transcended the mere accumulation of wealth. His reign was defined by a commitment to fostering a society where knowledge, culture, and education were paramount. His pilgrimage to Mecca may have been a symbol of his wealth, but it was the intellectual and cultural revolution he ignited in Timbuktu that would become the true measure of his empire's greatness. Mansa Musa's impact on Timbuktu and the Mali Empire is a reminder that empires are not solely defined by their military conquests or material wealth. They are shaped by the ideas, culture, and values they promote. Timbuktu's golden age, fostered by Mansa Musa's vision, would go on to influence generations of scholars, traders, and rulers long after his reign. It is a legacy that continues to echo through the pages of history, a testament to the enduring power of knowledge and culture in shaping the world. After the splendor of Mansa Musa's legendary pilgrimage to Mecca, a new chapter in the history of Timbuktu and the Mali Empire began to unfold. Musa's return from his journey, laden with gifts and stories of unimaginable wealth, had already established his empire's place on the global stage. The world had witnessed his extraordinary display of riches, and it was clear that Mali was a force to be reckoned with. But this was only the beginning of the cultural, intellectual, and political transformation that would soon redefine the very essence of the empire. In the wake of Mansa Musa's return to Mali, his reign marked the start of a cultural renaissance that would reverberate through the centuries. One of the most significant aspects of this transformation was the deliberate and strategic efforts to elevate Timbuktu, once a quiet desert outpost, into the center of knowledge and intellectual discourse in Africa. Musa's vision was far-reaching. He knew that wealth alone would not ensure the lasting greatness of his empire. Instead, he turned his attention to securing Mali's place as a beacon of Islamic scholarship, art, and culture. At the heart of this vision was Timbuktu itself, which Musa sought to make not only a hub of trade, but a city where learning and intellectual curiosity flourished. Timbuktu had always been a place of cultural and commercial exchange, situated at the intersection of trans-Saharan trade routes. But it was under Mansa Musa's rule that it began to shine as an intellectual powerhouse. Musa's reign coincided with a time when the Islamic world was experiencing a golden age of knowledge, with scholars and intellectuals traveling from distant lands to gather in cities like Cairo, Baghdad, and Cordoba. Musa, seeing the potential to elevate his empire and its capital, poured resources into attracting scholars, poets, philosophers, and architects from across the Muslim world. This was not a mere gesture of wealth. It was a calculated effort to bring the finest minds of the Islamic world to Timbuktu, ensuring that the city would become a focal point for knowledge and debate. The construction of architectural marvels in Timbuktu was one of the defining features of this cultural renaissance. Under Mansa Musa, the city saw the establishment of grand mosques, libraries, and centers of learning. The most prominent of these was the University of Sankore, which would become one of the most famous institutions of learning in the Islamic world. Sankore's library housed thousands of manuscripts, many of which are still studied by scholars today. It became a place where great minds from Africa and beyond could come together to debate, learn, and advance knowledge in fields ranging from astronomy and mathematics to medicine and theology. Timbuktu's newfound status as a hub of learning did not happen overnight, but was the result of years of careful planning and investment by Mansa Musa. He understood that an empire's cultural and intellectual legacy could last far longer than its military conquests or its wealth. He recognized that fostering an environment where ideas could flourish would ensure that Mali's influence would endure long after his reign. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the infrastructure of Timbuktu supported this vision, building schools, libraries, and other institutions of learning that would attract scholars from all corners of the Muslim world. As Timbuktu's prominence as a center of learning grew, so did its reputation as a beacon of Islamic culture. Scholars traveled from far and wide to study at the city's prestigious institutions. These scholars, some of whom had traveled across the Sahara from North Africa, brought with them not only their knowledge, but also their cultural practices. Timbuktu thus became a melting pot of diverse intellectual traditions, where scholars of varying backgrounds could share ideas, challenge one another, and contribute to the growth of knowledge. Mansa Musa's patronage of the arts and sciences extended beyond the confines of academia. He also invested in the visual and literary arts, commissioning architectural projects and supporting the work of poets, artists, and historians. Under his rule, Mali became a cultural epicenter where music, art, and literature thrived. The great mosques and palaces built during his reign became symbols of Mali's grandeur, while the written word was elevated to an art form. Manuscripts, some illuminated with intricate calligraphy and designs, were produced in vast numbers, cataloging the history of the empire and its people. These texts would become important records of Mali's achievements, and many of them remain invaluable sources of information today. Despite the cultural flourishing that took place during Mansa Musa's reign, there were challenges. Though his empire was vast and rich, it was not immune to the difficulties faced by any large state. The Mali Empire's size made it difficult to govern, and there were constant pressures from external forces, rival kingdoms, nomadic tribes, and the changing dynamics of trans-Saharan trade. Mansa Musa's ability to maintain control over such a vast territory, while also fostering the cultural renaissance that took place in Timbuktu, speaks to his skill as both a ruler and a strategist. The expansion of Mali's influence across West Africa also brought with it new opportunities for trade and diplomacy. Mansa Musa's reign saw an influx of goods and wealth into Timbuktu, further solidifying its position as a key player in the trans-Saharan trade network. Gold, salt, ivory, and slaves passed through the city's marketplaces, fueling the empire's economy and enabling Musa to continue his cultural investments. But Mansa Musa understood that the wealth of his empire could only go so far in guaranteeing its future. His vision extended beyond the immediate riches of the empire and sought to build something more lasting, a cultural and intellectual legacy that would endure for generations. In the centuries that followed, the glory of Timbuktu and the Mali Empire began to wane. After Mansa Musa's death, the empire was plagued by internal conflicts, succession struggles, and external invasions. The golden age of Timbuktu, which had flourished under Mansa Musa's rule, gradually faded. Yet, despite the decline of the empire, the intellectual and cultural achievements of Timbuktu continued to resonate throughout history. The city's libraries and manuscripts survived the tumult of war and invasion, and the legacy of Mansa Musa's reign continued to inspire generations of scholars, historians, and cultural figures. While Mansa Musa's empire would eventually crumble, his vision for Timbuktu as a center of learning left an indelible mark on the city's history. Timbuktu's status as a beacon of Islamic scholarship endured well beyond the collapse of the Mali Empire. The city continued to attract scholars, merchants, and travelers from across Africa and beyond, maintaining its reputation as a place of intellectual and cultural importance. What Mansa Musa achieved in his lifetime was not just the accumulation of wealth and power, but the creation of a lasting intellectual and cultural legacy. His reign was a pivotal moment in the history of West Africa, one that would influence the trajectory of the region for centuries. In the shadow of his reign, Timbuktu flourished as a city of learning, knowledge, and culture, with a legacy that endures to this day. It is a testament to the enduring power of intellectual and cultural pursuits in shaping the world, and to the vision of a ruler who understood that the true wealth of an empire lies not just in its gold, but in the knowledge and culture that it nurtures. As Mansa Musa's reign continued to shape the destiny of the Mali Empire, the ripples of his extraordinary leadership began to affect not only the immediate surroundings of West Africa, but also the wider world. His grand pilgrimage to Mecca had already ensured his name would be etched in the annals of history, but it was his commitment to fortifying Mali's position as a cultural and intellectual powerhouse that set his empire apart. Yet, as the empire expanded in influence and wealth, the complexities of ruling such a vast domain began to manifest in unexpected ways. Despite the prosperity of the empire, there were rising tensions both internally and externally that threatened the fragile equilibrium Mansa Musa had worked so hard to establish. Mansa Musa had overseen a dazzling period of prosperity, largely driven by the wealth from Mali's gold mines and the control of vital trade routes. This wealth allowed for unprecedented investment in Timbuktu and other cities under the empire's control. Temples, palaces, and mosques, made from sun-dried brick and wood, began to rise throughout the region. But it wasn't just the grandiosity of architecture that was changing. It was the very fabric of Mali society that was being woven into something much more sophisticated and enduring. The arts, education, and intellectual exchange thrived, bringing with them an era of unparalleled cultural prosperity. Timbuktu became not only a marketplace for commodities, but also for ideas. The city's libraries, under Mansa Musa's patronage, grew in size and importance, attracting scholars from across the Islamic world. However, as much as Mali flourished culturally, politically, and economically, the empire began to face several growing challenges that Mansa Musa could neither entirely control nor easily solve. Externally, one of the most significant challenges facing the empire was the rise of other powers around Mali. To the north, the Berber dynasties and the Kingdom of Morocco posed a continual threat. While Mansa Musa's wealth had ensured a strong military presence, the northern reaches of the empire were difficult to defend due to the vastness of the Sahara Desert. As much as Musa had worked to build a strong administrative infrastructure in the heartlands of Mali, maintaining influence in the far-flung provinces remained a constant struggle. With these external pressures mounting, Musa was forced to expend considerable resources in maintaining Mali's security and guarding its borders. Nonetheless, His ability to navigate these geopolitical complexities ensured that the empire's influence was maintained during his reign. On the internal front, there were several issues that began to surface over the course of Mansa Musa's rule. While the empire was vast and prosperous, the sheer scale of the territory made it difficult to govern efficiently. Mali was made up of diverse ethnic groups, cultures, and languages, and the empire's ability to unify these disparate communities under a single banner was an ongoing challenge. Mansa Musa, a ruler known for his wisdom and patience, sought to address these issues through a combination of political alliances, marriage, and diplomacy. His reign saw the consolidation of various smaller kingdoms and principalities into a united whole, though this unification was not without its tensions. The larger the empire grew, the more complicated governance became. The challenge of ensuring loyalty and coherence across such a vast territory tested the limits of Mali's infrastructure. The decentralization of power also became an issue. While the emperor himself wielded great authority, the further one moved away from the imperial capital, the less control the central government had over local affairs. Provincial governors, often with their own interests and agendas, sometimes took liberties with imperial mandates, leading to a sense of autonomy that undermined the unity Mansa Musa had worked to establish. The tensions between the imperial center and local power brokers began to grow, laying the groundwork for future instability in the empire. At the same time, the wealth flowing through Mali, though a source of immense power, also bred a degree of complacency. The empire had become so prosperous that it seemed impervious to any real external threat. This overconfidence, however, would later prove to be a dangerous assumption. As neighboring powers grew more organized and the dynamics of trade shifted, Mali's reliance on its gold reserves began to expose its vulnerability. The economy was heavily dependent on the flow of gold, and any disruption to the mining or trading of this precious metal could have a devastating impact on the empire's financial stability. This dependence on a single commodity, while initially a source of immense wealth, would later be a factor in the empire's decline. Even with these challenges, Mansa Musa's legacy continued to take shape throughout his reign. His vision of a Mali that was both wealthy and intellectually advanced was realized in ways that far surpassed many of his contemporaries' expectations. The roads between Mali's cities were well maintained, facilitating trade, travel, and communication. This infrastructure allowed for a relatively stable economy in an era when many empires were struggling to maintain their cohesion. Timbuktu, in particular, had emerged as a glittering symbol of this cultural and intellectual renaissance. By the time of Mansa Musa's later years, it was home to countless scholars, scientists, and religious leaders. The city was more than just a trading hub. It had transformed into a vast repository of knowledge, attracting some of the greatest minds from the Muslim world. The influx of scholars and the vibrant intellectual environment created a ripple effect that spread throughout the empire. Mansa Musa's investment in education had ensured that his legacy was not just a matter of wealth, but one of enlightenment. This legacy of learning would continue to benefit Mali even after his death. Yet, even as Timbuktu shone as a beacon of enlightenment, it became evident that maintaining such a high level of intellectual and cultural activity was not without its costs. The demands of sustaining this scholarly environment often came at the expense of the empire's military and political cohesion. It was in the years following Mansa Musa's death that the consequences of this imbalance would become most apparent. The empire's wealth, while a source of great pride, also served as an invitation for would-be conquerors to seize Mali's riches. The allure of gold, intellectual prestige, and a weakened political structure would ultimately attract rival kingdoms and foreign invaders seeking to take advantage of Mali's declining stability. But these challenges did not diminish Mansa Musa's achievements. The cultural and intellectual institutions he built in Timbuktu laid the groundwork for a thriving tradition of learning that would survive for centuries, long after the empire's political fortunes had waned. Musa's ability to attract the finest scholars, poets, and architect to his court ensured that Mali's intellectual legacy would remain firmly planted in the annals of history. Despite the challenges that arose during the latter part of Mansa Musa's reign, his empire stood as a testament to what could be achieved through visionary leadership. His strategic investment in both economic and intellectual resources allowed Mali to thrive, even as the world around it grew more complex. However, the empire's prosperity was also a double-edged sword. While wealth and education were the cornerstones of Mali's golden age, they also became the empire's Achilles heel, revealing its vulnerabilities as it entered an increasingly uncertain future. Mansa Musa's reign was ultimately a paradox. On the one hand, it saw the flourishing of one of the greatest empires in African history, marked by unparalleled wealth, cultural growth, and intellectual achievement. On the other hand, it sowed the seeds of the challenges that would later undermine the empire's political cohesion. Despite this, the Mali Empire, through its wealth, learning, and leadership, had achieved a unique and enduring place in the history of Africa and the world. As the empire evolved, and the long shadow of Mansa Musa's reign began to fade, the empire's impact continued to be felt. His legacy, woven through the intellectual vibrancy of Timbuktu and the wealth of the Mali people, remained an inspiration for generations to come. It was a legacy of vision, of an empire where gold and knowledge coexisted, and where the pursuit of wisdom was seen as integral to the empire's greatness. As the years passed and Mansa Musa's reign became a distant memory, the once mighty Mali Empire began to experience the inevitable shifts that come with time. The wealth that had sustained it, the intellect that had flourished within its borders, and the cities that had risen to prominence now faced the challenges of maintaining unity, stability, and relevance in an increasingly complex world. The empire was vast, sprawling across regions as diverse as the Sahara Desert, the Sahel, and the rich lands south of the Niger River. Yet, as the winds of change blew through the heart of Mali, its golden age, marked by intellectual and cultural achievements, began to wane, and the prosperity of the past began to give way to a more uncertain future. The first cracks in the empire's political structure began to appear shortly after Mansa Musa's death in 1337. Though he had carefully managed his empire through a combination of military strength, diplomacy, and cultural patronage, the empire was left without a ruler of his caliber. Successive rulers, although competent in their own right, struggled to command the same level of authority and respect that Mansa Musa had garnered. In the years that followed, the empire saw a series of power struggles, with rival factions competing for control over Mali's vast resources. The centralization that had been so effective under Mansa Musa's reign began to fragment, and regional governors grew more powerful, often acting with near independence from the capital. While the heart of the empire, cities like Niani, Gao, and Timbuktu, remained prosperous, the further one traveled from the capital, the less cohesive and more fragmented the empire became. At the same time, external pressures began to mount. Mali's control over the trans-Saharan trade routes, which had been a cornerstone of its wealth and influence, was increasingly threatened by rival kingdoms and nomadic groups. The rise of the kingdom of Songhai to the east presented a direct challenge to Mali's dominance in the region. Songhai, once a vassal state under Mali's rule, had grown in strength and ambition. Under the leadership of figures like Sunni Ali and later Askia Muhammad, Songhai began to challenge Mali's territorial holdings and trade routes, particularly in the Niger River basin. As Songhai expanded, it undermined Mali's influence and began to pull away regions that had once been part of the empire's heartland. The loss of key territories to Songhai was a major blow to Mali's authority, and it marked the beginning of a gradual decline in the empire's territorial integrity. Meanwhile, the threat from the north remained ever-present. The Berber dynasties, particularly the Almoravids and later the Almohads, continued to press down from the north. These powerful Muslim empires, based in Morocco, had long been a source of tension for Mali. Although the Berbers were initially allies in the spread of Islam across the Sahel, their growing influence and expansionist ambitions began to create friction between them and the Mali Empire. The Berbers, with their well-organized military forces and stronghold over the Mediterranean coast, posed a constant threat to the stability of Mali's northern provinces. In the 14th century, Morocco's imperial ambitions were amplified by the desire to control the lucrative salt and gold trade that flowed through Mali. As trade routes shifted and Berber forces became more active, the Mali Empire found itself struggling to defend its borders, particularly in the desert regions where its influence was thin. Mali's decline was not a swift or immediate process, but rather a slow unraveling, a gradual erosion of the very foundations that had once made the empire so powerful. Despite the struggles, the cities within the empire, especially Timbuktu, retained a certain degree of cultural and intellectual vibrancy for some time. Timbuktu, though losing some of its political influence, remained a focal point of learning, attracting scholars from across the Islamic world. The University of Sankore, with its vast libraries and intellectual environment, continued to thrive. But even here, the seeds of decline were beginning to take root. As the empire weakened, the resources available to support such institutions dwindled. The level of patronage from the central government began to diminish, and the once grand libraries and schools began to suffer from neglect. The intellectual vibrancy that Mansa Musa had nurtured was slowly fading, as was the ability to maintain a consistent flow of scholars and thinkers into the city. The decline of Mali also had a profound impact on the empire's economy. While it had once been the world's foremost producer of gold, the shift in trade routes and the depletion of resources began to take their toll. Gold, once Mali's greatest asset, was becoming scarcer, and the control over the trans-Saharan trade routes, vital for the flow of not only gold but also salt, ivory, and slaves, was no longer as secure as it once had been. The once thriving trade cities of Mali, such as Timbuktu, Jin, and Gao, began to lose their status as key trading hubs as merchants began to shift their focus toward emerging centers of commerce in the Songhai Empire and other regions. As the empire's wealth dwindled, so too did its military strength. The armies of Mali, once feared across West Africa for their size and organization, began to fragment as regional governors took more control over their own military forces. With a lack of centralized coordination, Mali's military capability eroded. The once unstoppable forces that had defended the empire's borders began to struggle against both internal uprisings and external invasions. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, Mali found itself increasingly vulnerable to attacks from its enemies. The Songhai Empire, once a vassal state, was now rising in power and steadily taking control of the regions once under Mali's influence. The loss of territories in the Niger River Valley was particularly significant, as it not only diminished Mali's economic power, but also cut off vital trade routes that had been a lifeline for the empire. Yet, even as the empire faced these mounting challenges, there were moments of resistance, moments where the people of Mali sought to hold onto the legacy that Mansa Musa had created. In the face of these pressures, some of the later rulers attempted to strengthen the empire's unity and protect its territories. However, without the unifying force of Mansa Musa's leadership and vision, these efforts proved insufficient. The internal divisions within the empire, the loss of key regions, and the ongoing external threats led to a slow disintegration of Mali's power. By the early 16th century, Mali was no longer the dominant empire it had once been. The Songhai Empire, now firmly established as the preeminent power in West Africa, controlled much of the territory that had once belonged to Mali. Timbuktu, though still a center of learning, was no longer the imperial capital it had been in Mansa Musa's time. The wealth and influence of Mali were now a shadow of their former selves, as the empire slowly faded into history. The decline of the Mali Empire was not a single event, but rather a gradual erosion of power, driven by a combination of internal strife, external pressure, and shifting economic realities. Mansa Musa's legacy, however, remained etched in the cultural and intellectual fabric of the region. The libraries and mosques that had been built during his reign stood as monuments to the greatness of the empire. Timbuktu, while no longer the political center it had once been, continued to draw scholars and traders from across the Muslim world, a testament to the enduring influence of the Mali Empire's golden age. Even as the Mali Empire crumbled, the world took note of its achievements. The intellectual and cultural legacy of Mansa Musa's reign would continue to influence generations of scholars, historians, and rulers. His patronage of education, his promotion of Islam, and his visionary leadership had created an empire that was a beacon of wealth and learning in Africa. Though the political power of Mali had faded, its legacy would resonate for centuries to come, influencing the development of West Africa and leaving a lasting imprint on the history of the world. As the Mali Empire receded into the annals of history, the legacy of Mansa Musa remained a powerful echo, reverberating not only through the desert sands of West Africa, but also across the vast stretch of time. The once great empire, now fragmented and weakened, had seen its political and military power dissolve into a distant memory, but the intellectual and cultural vibrancy that Mansa Musa had fostered continued to endure. It was within this shifting context that the story of Mali's decline began to merge with the rise of new powers in West Africa. Despite the challenges faced by the empire, the cultural centers established during the Golden Age would go on to shape the trajectory of the region for centuries to come, and Mali's legacy would continue to influence the course of African history long after its political downfall. Timbuktu, the jewel of Mansa Musa's empire, had witnessed both the heights of cultural and intellectual flourishing as well as the onset of decline. In the centuries following Mansa Musa's death, it remained a symbol of the splendor of Mali's golden age, attracting scholars, traders, and explorers from all corners of the Islamic world. The city had been more than just a prosperous trade center. It had become a repository of knowledge, a place where the most profound intellectual pursuits were carried out. The libraries and universities that Mansa Musa had nurtured, particularly the renowned University of Sankore, continued to be a source of pride for the region, despite the political turbulence surrounding them. Yet, as the empire weakened and external pressures mounted, Timbuktu's role as a political and economic center began to wane. The Songhai Empire, under the leadership of powerful rulers like Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad, began to exert its influence over the region, gradually eclipsing Mali's dominance. Songhai's territorial expansion into the Niger River Valley, coupled with its growing military power, led to the loss of key Mali territories. Timbuktu, once a center of political power and the seat of Mali's imperial administration, now found itself under the control of the Songhai Empire, marking the end of an era. While the shift in political power may have marked the end of Mali's reign, it did not mean the end of Timbuktu's cultural significance. In fact, under Songhai rule, the city's intellectual legacy continued to shine. The preservation of Timbuktu's libraries, with their vast collection of manuscripts, and the continued patronage of scholars ensured that the city remained a hub of learning. Scholars continued to travel to Timbuktu to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and theology. The city's reputation as a center of intellectual excellence persisted, even as the political landscape changed. Timbuktu had become a symbol not just of Mali's past glory, but of Africa's intellectual heritage. Despite this continuity of intellectual life, the region was no stranger to the complexities of its shifting political order. The end of Mali's empire did not mark an immediate or smooth transition to Songhai dominance. Songhai, though more militarily formidable, faced its own set of challenges in consolidating control over the vast territories that had once belonged to Mali. There were rebellions and uprisings, and maintaining order in the distant provinces that had previously belonged to the Mali Empire proved difficult. However, the Songhai Empire's rise signified a new chapter in the region's history, one where Mali's intellectual and cultural legacy would continue to be honored, even if political power had shifted. The decline of Mali also exposed the vulnerabilities inherent in a large, wealthy empire. As the empire grew, it had become increasingly difficult to manage the far-flung regions, and the decentralized nature of power in the latter years of Mansa Musa's reign had undermined the unity of the state. Provincial governors, empowered by the empire's wealth, had begun to exercise more autonomy, often at odds with the imperial center. This decentralization led to political fragmentation, which in turn made it easier for external powers to take advantage of Mali's weakened state. The loss of territories to Songhai and other external threats marked the fragmentation of Mali's vast empire, but also forced the region's inhabitants to adapt and innovate in order to preserve their culture and heritage. During the period following Mali's decline, the region was far from stagnant. While the political landscape shifted, the cultural and intellectual traditions that had been established during Mansa Musa's reign continued to evolve. Timbuktu, though no longer the political capital it once was, remained a vibrant center of learning. The manuscripts and texts that had been preserved during Mali's Golden Age were still studied and copied by scholars. Some of these manuscripts, written by the greatest minds of the era, continue to survive, offering invaluable insights into the intellectual achievements of the time. They are a testament to the enduring legacy of the Mali Empire and Mansa Musa's vision for a prosperous, enlightened society. Timbuktu's influence extended beyond the borders of the Mali and Songhai empires. The city had become a focal point for Islamic scholars and traders traveling from regions as far as North Africa and the Middle East. The influence of Timbuktu's universities spread throughout the Muslim world, and the city became an intellectual meeting point where scholars could exchange ideas and debate pressing theological and scientific questions. Timbuktu had, in essence, become a microcosm of the larger intellectual currents of the medieval Islamic world, and its influence reached far beyond the confines of West Africa. Even as Songhai's political dominance grew, its rulers understood the value of the intellectual legacy that Mali had left behind. The importance of education, scholarship, and culture was not lost on the Songhai rulers, who continued to invest in the cities and institutions that had once been the pride of Mali. The patronage of scholars and the preservation of intellectual traditions continued to be a priority under the Songhai Empire, ensuring that the region's reputation as a center of learning endured. However, Songhai was not immune to the same challenges that had plagued Mali. Though it was initially more centralized and militarily formidable, Songhai's vast territory and diverse peoples presented their own set of governance challenges. The empire struggled with internal dissent, especially in the outlying regions that had been part of the Mali Empire. Over time, these internal divisions, combined with external invasions and the exhaustion of resources, would lead to Songhai's eventual downfall in the late 16th century. Like Mali before it, Songhai's power would erode and its territories would fracture. Despite the political disintegration of the Mali and Songhai empires, the legacy of these great empires continued to shape the history of West Africa. The cultural and intellectual traditions that had been fostered in Timbuktu remained a part of the region's identity. Even in the face of political turmoil and external threats, the values of knowledge, scholarship, and intellectual pursuit endured. Timbuktu, although no longer the imperial center it once was, remained a symbol of the richness of African intellectual and cultural life. The city's libraries and manuscripts became treasured artifacts, and scholars continued to study them, preserving the knowledge and insights of an era long past. As time went on, the world began to take greater notice of the rich intellectual heritage that had once flourished in the Sahel. European explorers, colonialists, and scholars began to recognize the significance of Timbuktu and the role it had played in shaping the intellectual landscape of the medieval world. While the political powers of Mali and Songhai faded into history, the intellectual legacy of these empires remained a point of pride for Africa and the wider world. The story of Timbuktu's enduring legacy is a story of resilience and adaptation. Despite the collapse of the great empires that once ruled over the region, the spirit of intellectual curiosity and cultural preservation continued to thrive. Even as new powers rose and the world changed, the values of education, scholarship, and intellectual pursuit remained a cornerstone of West African identity. This enduring legacy is a testament to the vision of Mansa Musa and the generations of scholars, artists, and thinkers who followed in his footsteps. They had created a legacy that would endure long after the political power of their empires had faded, ensuring that the intellectual contributions of Mali and Timbuktu would remain a significant part of the world's cultural and intellectual heritage for centuries to come. The eventual fall of the Mali Empire did not erase its indelible imprint on the broader tapestry of West African history, nor did it sever the cultural and intellectual lineage that had been carefully cultivated by Mansa Musa. Even as the political and military authority of Mali gradually weakened, its legacy persisted, morphing into a new form as neighboring regions took up the mantle of intellectual, cultural, and economic advancement. One such region that inherited much of the prestige and influence of the former empire was the Kingdom of Songhai. While Songhai's rise marked the end of Mali's political dominance, it also represented the continuation of the tradition of intellectual grandeur that had been established under Mansa Musa's reign. By the time the Songhai Empire emerged as the preeminent power in West Africa, it had absorbed many aspects of the earlier Mali civilization, including its sophisticated trade networks, administrative structures, and, perhaps most importantly, its rich cultural heritage. The historical trajectory of the region, shaped by centuries of interaction between diverse peoples and cultures, became a vital force in maintaining the continuity of knowledge and education that had been nurtured in Timbuktu. The Songhai Empire, led by figures like Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad, sought to consolidate power in a way that would safeguard and even expand upon the cultural wealth of the Sahel. With its focus on military conquest, territorial expansion, and economic consolidation, Songhai proved itself capable of bringing many of the regions that had once fallen under Mali's rule back into its sphere of influence. However, it was not only Songhai's military might that would leave a lasting legacy. It was also its role in preserving and enhancing the intellectual tradition that Mansa Musa had initiated. Although Songhai had its roots in the older Mali Empire, it was able to expand its reach and influence due to a more centralized administrative structure. This allowed the Songhai kings, most notably Askia Muhammad, to exert greater control over their territory and its cultural output. Under his rule, the empire's capital, Gao, became a flourishing hub of trade and governance. But perhaps more significantly, the city became a focal point for the preservation and growth of the intellectual achievements of the previous era. Timbuktu, although no longer the political heart of the region, retained its position as an intellectual and religious center. The city continued to attract scholars, philosophers, and scientists from the far reaches of the Islamic world. With its renowned libraries and schools, including the University of Sankore, Timbuktu continued to serve as a beacon of learning. The manuscripts that had been collected during the golden age of the Mali Empire, many of which were preserved and copied by generations of scholars, became invaluable treasures for the Songhai rulers. This body of knowledge provided the intellectual foundation upon which the Songhai Empire would continue to build. Timbuktu's libraries, which had been expanded under the patronage of Mansa Musa, remained filled with rare texts that covered a wide range of subjects, from astronomy to law, mathematics to literature. The city's continued prominence as a center of learning allowed it to function as an intellectual bridge between North Africa, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. This cultural and intellectual legacy was far-reaching and extended beyond the borders of Songhai. Scholars from as far as Cairo, Mecca, and even Spain would travel to Timbuktu to consult the vast wealth of knowledge stored in its libraries. This scholarly exchange helped create a shared intellectual and religious culture that spanned much of the Muslim world, influencing everything from political governance to scientific discovery. The intellectual vibrancy of Songhai's reign, bolstered by the legacy of Mali's golden age, was not limited to Timbuktu. The empire's rulers understood the power of education, and they invested in the development of educational institutions across their territories. The construction of madrasas, the funding of scholarly pursuits, and the establishment of centers of learning in cities like Gao Jin, and even Walata all reflected the Songhai Empire's commitment to preserving and expanding the cultural capital it had inherited from the Mali Empire. The promotion of literacy and scholarship became an important aspect of Songhai rule, contributing to the continuity of the intellectual tradition that had made Timbuktu so famous. This commitment to learning was not confined to religious or philosophical subjects alone. During the Songhai Empire's height, there was a renewed interest in scientific studies, particularly in fields such as astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Scholars and astronomers based in Timbuktu produced elaborate astronomical charts, cataloging the movements of the stars and planets. Mathematics was another area of focus, with scholars working on complex calculations and advancing knowledge about geometry, trigonometry, and algebra. These intellectual achievements, combined with the flourishing of literature, history, and law, ensure that the intellectual legacy of Mali and Timbuktu remains central to the Songhai Empire's sense of identity. Yet, the rise of Songhai and the continuity of intellectual life in the region did not shield the empire from the challenges that had plagued Mali. Songhai, too, would eventually face a combination of internal strife, external invasion, and the collapse of its central authority. Despite the intellectual and cultural flourishing under Songhai's rule, the empire's political and military cohesion began to weaken toward the end of the 16th century. One of the key factors contributing to Songhai's eventual decline was the internal divisions within the empire. The Songhai Empire, like its predecessor Mali, was a vast, sprawling state with a diverse population that included different ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups. While the empire's central government was strong during the reign of Askia Muhammad, later rulers struggled to maintain unity among these different groups. Regional governors, who had considerable autonomy, often rebelled against central authority, and tensions between the ruling elite and local populations grew. This fragmentation within the empire created opportunities for external powers to exploit its vulnerabilities. Externally, Songhai faced increasing threats from powerful neighboring states. The rise of Morocco, in particular, proved to be a formidable challenge. In 1591, a Moroccan army, under the command of Judar Pasha, launched a successful invasion of the Songhai Empire, defeating the Songhai forces at the Battle of Tondabai. The Moroccan forces, armed with firearms and advanced military tactics, were able to overwhelm Songhai's traditional armies, effectively bringing an end to the empire's dominance in West Africa. The fall of Songhai marked the end of a significant chapter in the region's history, as the once mighty empire was absorbed into the growing influence of Moroccan power. Despite the political collapse of the Songhai Empire, the legacy of the Mali and Songhai empires endured, particularly in the intellectual sphere. Timbuktu, though no longer the political capital of any empire, retained its position as a center of learning and scholarship. The libraries that had been accumulated over centuries continued to house precious manuscripts, many of which were preserved through the upheavals that accompanied the fall of the empire. Scholars, though displaced and scattered, continued to study these texts, ensuring that the knowledge contained within them would not be lost to history. The decline of both Mali and Songhai, while a significant moment in West African history, did not mark the end of the region's intellectual or cultural significance. Despite the political fragmentation that followed the fall of the two empires, West Africa remained a region of intellectual vibrancy. Scholars continued to produce important works in literature, history, science, and law. Timbuktu, despite its loss of political power, remained a symbol of the region's cultural and intellectual richness, a place where the legacy of Mansa Musa's vision continued to inspire those who sought knowledge. In the centuries following the collapse of Mali and Songhai, the intellectual tradition of the Sahel would influence many other parts of Africa and the Islamic world. The manuscripts produced in Timbuktu and the scholarship of the region would have a lasting impact on the development of education and intellectual life in the broader Muslim world. While the political landscape of West Africa had shifted dramatically, the intellectual legacy of Mansa Musa's reign, which had fostered the creation of great libraries, centers of learning, and intellectual discourse, remained a cornerstone of West African identity. The enduring influence of Mali and Songhai's intellectual traditions, especially in Timbuktu, would continue to shape the historical memory of the region. It stands as a testament to the vision of Mansa Musa, whose reign, though it ended long ago, laid the foundation for an intellectual legacy that continues to inspire scholars, historians, and thinkers to this day. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Sahel region was no longer dominated by the great empires of Mali and Songhai, whose towering legacies had once influenced the course of West African history. The collapse of these empires, each weakened by a combination of internal strife, military defeat, and external pressures, opened the door for new political entities to rise and fill the vacuum left in the wake of their disintegration. Yet, while the political and military power of these once great empires had faded, their cultural and intellectual legacies continued to echo through the centuries, influencing not only the West African region, but the wider world. In the aftermath of the fall of Songhai in the late 16th century, a period of instability and fragmentation ensued across the Sahel and the surrounding regions. However, while political unity and military power seemed to elude the successor states, the cultural and intellectual influence of the great empires of the past remained undeniable. One of the most enduring aspects of the Mali and Songhai empires was their commitment to learning, scholarship, and the preservation of knowledge. Even as political power shifted, the intellectual legacy of these empires lived on through the manuscripts, libraries, and scholars that continued to thrive in the cities of the Sahel, particularly in Timbuktu. Timbuktu, which had long been the heart of intellectual and cultural life in the region, continued to draw scholars, merchants, and travelers from across Africa and beyond. While the political landscape of West Africa had changed, Timbuktu remained a beacon of knowledge, a place where the intellectual currents of the Islamic world converged with the ancient traditions of African scholarship. The manuscripts housed in the city's libraries, many of which have been passed down through generations of scholars, continue to be a source of pride and inspiration. These manuscripts, covering a wide range of subjects from astronomy to mathematics, history to law, were invaluable repositories of knowledge, preserving the intellectual achievements of Mali and Songhai for posterity. The preservation of knowledge in Timbuktu was no small feat despite the tumultuous political environment. Scholars in the city remained committed to maintaining and expanding upon the intellectual legacy of the past. The libraries of Timbuktu, once patronized by the great emperors of Mali and Songhai, continue to function as vital centers of learning. The manuscripts housed within them were carefully copied, studied, and taught, ensuring that the intellectual contributions of the past were not lost to time. The city became a hub for the study of Islamic theology, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, and it continued to attract scholars from across the Islamic world. One of the most significant aspects of the intellectual life in Timbuktu was its diversity. Scholars in the city came from a variety of backgrounds, bringing with them a wealth of knowledge and experience from different regions. The exchange of ideas between African scholars and those from the broader Islamic world helped to create a rich intellectual environment in Timbuktu. This intellectual exchange was not confined to religious scholarship alone. It also included the study of scientific and mathematical principles, legal systems, and historical narratives. The combination of African traditions and Islamic scholarship created a unique and vibrant intellectual culture that was reflective of the broader world, yet distinctly African in its approach. While Timbuktu remained a center of learning, the political fragmentation of West Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries resulted in a shift in the region's balance of power. The rise of new political entities, such as the Kingdom of Sokoto and the Fulani Jihad movement, introduced new dynamics into the Sahel. These new powers, though they were not able to match the military might or cultural grandeur of the Mali and Songhai empires, began to exert influence over the region. The rise of these new political entities also had an impact on the intellectual landscape of the Sahel, as they brought with them new ideas and perspectives that began to shape the direction of scholarship in the region. One of the key factors that influenced the intellectual direction of the Sahel during this period was the spread of Sufism. The Sufi mysticism that had been introduced to West Africa during the rise of Islam became an important intellectual and spiritual force in the region. Sufi orders, particularly the Tijaniya and Qadiriya, gained prominence in West Africa, and their influence began to shape the intellectual and religious landscape of the region. The spread of Sufism helped to create a more decentralized religious culture, one that placed emphasis on personal spiritual experience and the cultivation of inner knowledge. This shift in the religious climate also had an impact on the intellectual life of the region, as Sufi scholars emphasized the importance of spiritual knowledge alongside formal religious education. While the political fragmentation of the region during this period prevented the rise of any single dominant power, it also allowed for the continued flourishing of intellectual and cultural life in West Africa. The decline of the Mali and Songhai empires did not mean the end of the region's intellectual achievements. Instead, the cultural and intellectual legacy of these empires continued to resonate, even in the face of political upheaval. In many ways, the decline of these great empires and the rise of new political forces marked a turning point in the history of West Africa. The region began to evolve, adapting to new challenges and incorporating new ideas. The intellectual legacy of Mali and Songhai, while no longer at the forefront of political power, continued to be a driving force in shaping the cultural identity of the Sahel. Timbuktu, though no longer the political center it once was, remained a symbol of intellectual achievement and cultural continuity. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the intellectual life of West Africa began to take on new forms. The rise of the transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly removed millions of Africans from the continent, had a profound impact on the region. The forced migration of Africans to the Americas disrupted the traditional social and political structures of West Africa, but it also led to the creation of new diaspora communities that would later play a significant role in the cultural and intellectual exchange between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. At the same time, the expansion of European colonialism in Africa began to reshape the political landscape of the continent. By the late 19th century, much of West Africa had been carved up by European powers, and the legacy of the great empires of Mali and Songhai seemed distant and irrelevant to the colonial powers that controlled the region. However, the intellectual traditions of the Sahel continued to influence the broader African world, as intellectuals and scholars began to look back at the rich history of the region as a source of pride and inspiration. The colonial period, though a time of disruption and displacement, also marked a period of intellectual renewal. African scholars, many of whom had been trained in colonial schools, began to turn to the past to reclaim their cultural heritage and to challenge the narratives imposed by European colonial powers. The intellectual legacy of Timbuktu, Mali, and Songhai became a vital source of resistance to colonialism and a means of asserting African identity. The manuscripts that had been preserved in Timbuktu, once considered mere relics of a bygone era, were rediscovered and revered as symbols of the intellectual and cultural richness of the African past. The intellectual revival that began in the colonial period would lay the groundwork for the post-independence movements that emerged across Africa in the mid-20th century. African scholars, writers, and activists began to draw on the intellectual traditions of the past to advocate for political independence, cultural pride, and social justice. The legacy of Mansa Musa, the great rulers of Mali and Songhai, and the scholars of Timbuktu continued to inspire African intellectuals and political leaders who sought to reclaim Africa's place in the world and to build a future grounded in the rich traditions of their ancestors. The centuries following the fall of Mali and Songhai may have been marked by political fragmentation and foreign domination, but the intellectual legacy of these great empires never truly disappeared. It lived on in the hearts and minds of scholars, writers, and activists who recognized the importance of their cultural heritage and worked tirelessly to preserve it. The story of Timbuktu, once a symbol of the intellectual grandeur of Mali, became a metaphor for the resilience of African scholarship in the face of adversity. The lessons of the past, embodied in the manuscripts and teachings of Timbuktu, continued to guide the intellectual, cultural, and political movements of West Africa and beyond, ensuring that the legacy of Mali's golden age would never be forgotten. The history of West Africa, shaped by its great empires, is a narrative that reflects the complexities of power, culture, and transformation. Following the decline of the Mali and Songhai empires, West Africa entered a new phase in its history, one that was characterized not only by political fragmentation and external invasion, but also by a rich, enduring cultural and intellectual legacy. The collapse of these once mighty empires did not signify the end of West Africa's historical importance, nor did it diminish the region's contribution to the broader Islamic and African worlds. Instead, the period after the fall of Mali and Songhai marks the emergence of new political entities, the reinvigoration of intellectual traditions, and the continued cultural influence of the great empires that preceded them. In the wake of the disintegration of the Mali and Songhai empires, the political landscape of West Africa was fragmented. No single power rose to replace the former empires, leaving a patchwork of smaller kingdoms, states, and city-states that exercised varying degrees of influence and control over the region. These new political entities, while unable to match the scale and grandeur of their predecessors, were still shaped by the legacies of Mali and Songhai in profound ways. They inherited not only the political and military systems of the great empires, but also the intellectual and cultural traditions that had made them so influential. One of the most significant legacies left by the Mali and Songhai empires was their commitment to education and scholarship. This intellectual tradition, centered around the vibrant city of Timbuktu, remained a beacon of learning and knowledge throughout the Sahel region. Despite the collapse of the political systems that had supported them, the scholarly traditions that had flourished under Mansa Musa and the Songhai rulers continued to thrive. Timbuktu's libraries, which housed manuscripts on a wide range of subjects including astronomy, mathematics, law, medicine, and history, remained a center of learning for centuries. The intellectual environment that had been nurtured by Mansa Musa's patronage persisted, even in the face of political instability. Timbuktu, though no longer the political capital of an empire, continued to attract scholars and students from across the Muslim world. The city's reputation as a center of learning spread far beyond the borders of West Africa, and it became a symbol of the intellectual and cultural vibrancy of the Sahel. While the political power of Mali and Songhai had faded, the legacy of Timbuktu's intellectual tradition was undiminished. Scholars who had once studied under the great teachers of the Mali and Songhai empires continued to pass down their knowledge to the next generation, ensuring that the intellectual foundations of the past would not be forgotten. Despite the political fragmentation that followed the fall of Mali and Songhai, the intellectual networks that had been established by the great empires continued to flourish. Scholars from different parts of Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe continued to make their way to Timbuktu, where they studied the texts that had been preserved in the city's libraries. These scholars engaged in lively debates on theology, philosophy, and science, contributing to the ongoing development of knowledge in the region. The intellectual traditions of Timbuktu remained deeply connected to the broader Islamic world, and the city continued to serve as a bridge between Africa and the Middle East, fostering the exchange of ideas and knowledge. The rise of new political entities in West Africa also had a profound impact on the region's intellectual life. While these smaller states and kingdoms could not rival the military might or territorial reach of Mali and Songhai, they played an important role in preserving and promoting the intellectual and cultural heritage of the Sahel. Kingdoms like the Sokoto Caliphate, founded by the Fulani jihadists in the early 19th century, drew on the intellectual traditions of the earlier empires. The Sokoto Caliphate, which extended across parts of present-day Nigeria, Niger, and Cameroon, became a new center of Islamic scholarship in West Africa. The Caliphate's rulers, inspired by the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad and the intellectual traditions of the Mali and Songhai empires, placed a strong emphasis on education and the spread of Islamic knowledge. Under the Sokoto Caliphate, religious scholars and jurists played a central role in governance, contributing to the development of a legal and administrative system based on Islamic principles. The emphasis on education was reflected in the establishment of numerous madrasas, schools dedicated to Islamic studies, where students could study the Quran, Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, and Islamic law, Sharia. The Sokoto Caliphate's commitment to scholarship and education helped to preserve and expand the intellectual heritage of the Sahel, ensuring that the region's rich intellectual traditions continued to thrive even after the fall of the great empires. However, the legacy of Mali and Songhai was not limited to the preservation of intellectual traditions. The cultural practices, artistic achievements, and social structures that had been developed during the golden ages of these empires continued to influence the region long after their political decline. In the arts, literature, and music, the cultural traditions of the Mali and Songhai empires endured. The oral traditions that have been passed down through generations, often in the form of epic poems, songs, and stories, remained a central part of West African cultural life. These oral traditions, which celebrated the history, heroes, and myths of the region, played a key role in preserving the collective memory of the great empires and ensuring that their legacies were kept alive in the hearts and minds of the people. The influence of the Mali and Songhai empires can also be seen in the architecture of the region. The great mosques and palaces that had been built during the golden age of these empires continued to inspire new generations of architects and builders. In cities like Timbuktu, Jin, and Gao, the architectural style developed during the reigns of Mansa Musa and his successors remained an important cultural symbol. The distinctive mud brick architecture, with its intricate geometric patterns and large, domed structures, became a hallmark of West African architecture and an enduring symbol of the region's cultural heritage. Despite the collapse of the political power of Mali and Songhai, their cultural influence continued to resonate throughout the region. The arts, education, and social structures that had been established during the golden age of these empires provided the foundation for the new political entities that emerged in their wake. The intellectual and cultural legacy of these empires, preserved in Timbuktu and other centers of learning, continued to shape the identity of West Africa long after their political power had faded. The eventual arrival of European colonial powers in the 19th century, which further fragmented the political landscape of West Africa, did not erase the region's rich cultural heritage. In fact, colonialism played a paradoxical role in the preservation of the intellectual traditions of Mali and Songhai. Although the European powers sought to impose their own systems of governance, education, and culture, they could not fully eradicate the deep-rooted traditions of West Africa. Scholars in the colonial era, many of them African, began to rediscover the intellectual and cultural achievements of the past. In doing so, they helped to ensure that the legacies of Mali and Songhai would continue to influence African identity and thought in the modern era.